They say blood is thicker than water. They say marriage is a sacred bond. But what happens when the two people you trust the most in this world decide to cut you out of the picture, and everyone you love watches from the sidelines, silent and complicit? My name is Elena, and for 3 years, I lived a life that was a beautifully crafted lie. I was the lucky one, the woman who had it all: a successful career, a loving husband named Mark, and a sister, Sarah, who was essentially my other half. We were inseparable. Mark and I had just bought our dream home, and Sarah was the first person I called with the news. She was the one who helped me pick out the paint colors, the one who spent every Sunday brunch with us, the one who was practically an aunt to the children we hadn't even had yet. The betrayal didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper, a strange glance, a phone call cut short. But the realization, the moment my entire reality shattered, happened on a Tuesday afternoon. It was supposed to be a mundane day. I had a business trip to Chicago that was scheduled to last 4 days. I was supposed to be sitting in a boardroom finalizing a contract. Instead, I was sitting in an airport terminal staring at a canceled flight notification, feeling a strange, nagging urge to just go home. I didn't tell Mark. I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to walk through that door, cook his favorite meal, and see the look of genuine joy on his face when he realized I was back early. I took an Uber from the airport, the rain lashing against the windows, reflecting the gray, unsettled feeling that had been sitting in the pit of my stomach for weeks. I didn't text anyone. I had my key, I had my excitement, and I had absolutely no idea that I was walking into the funeral of my own life. When I unlocked the front door, the house was silent. Too silent. The air felt heavy, stagnant. I dropped my luggage in the foyer, the thud of the suitcase echoing through the hallway. "Mark?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and foreign in the quiet. No answer. I walked toward the kitchen, thinking maybe he was in the backyard or the garage. But as I passed the living room, I stopped. The sliding glass doors leading to our back deck were cracked open just an inch, letting in the damp, chilly air. And then I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't Mark's laugh, it was Sarah's. It was that specific, throaty, slightly hysterical laugh she only did when she was truly happy. And then Mark's voice, low and intimate. "She's going to be in Chicago until Friday. We have time." My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it had been ripped out of my chest and trampled on. I stood paralyzed, my hand gripping the doorframe until my knuckles turned white. My breathing became shallow, jagged. I didn't want to look. I wanted to turn around, walk out that door, and pretend I had never heard a word. But my body betrayed me. I moved closer, driven by a sick, masochistic curiosity that I couldn't control. I peered through the crack in the door. There they were. Mark, my husband of 3 years, sitting on our outdoor sofa, and Sarah, my little sister, straddling his lap. They were tangled together, their clothes disheveled, in a way that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Mark's hands were buried in her hair, and Sarah was whispering something into his ear, her face alight with an expression I had only ever seen when she was looking at me. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion. I felt the world tilt. The rain outside seemed to scream against the glass. I realized in that split second that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. The way they moved, the casual intimacy of it, the way they seemed so comfortable in their shared sin, this had been going on for a long, long time. And then, the thought that broke me, if this was so routine, if they were this comfortable in my home, on my sofa, in our space, who else knew? I didn't scream. I didn't kick the door open. I did something much more dangerous. I backed away, silent as a ghost, retreating into the darkness of the hallway. I grabbed my suitcase, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I walked out the front door, leaving the wreckage of my marriage behind. But as I stood in the pouring rain, fumbling for my phone to call another Uber, my mother's name popped up on my screen. I picked it up, my voice trembling, and the first thing she said wasn't, "Hello?" but, "Oh, Elena, are you already home? We thought you were in Chicago." The we. She didn't say I, she said we. And in that freezing, miserable rain, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a betrayal by two people, it was a conspiracy. And I was the only one who hadn't been invited to the party. The Uber ride felt like a descent into hell. Every mile taking me further away from the house I thought was a sanctuary, but was actually a cage. My mother's voice kept looping in my head. "We thought you were in Chicago." That plural pronoun, that one tiny word, stripped away the last shred of my denial. It wasn't just a secret affair, it was a state secret maintained by an entire network of people who claimed to love me. I wasn't going to a hotel to sleep, I was going to a hotel to deconstruct my life. I checked into a hotel downtown under a different name, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type my own details into the registration form. The clerk looked at me with pity. I must have looked like a wreck. Mascara smeared across my cheeks, my hair plastered to my forehead by the rain, but I didn't care. I needed Wi-Fi. I needed a locked door, and I needed to stop the world from spinning so I could see what was actually going on. Once I was in the room, I didn't even bother taking off my coat. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I had to know how long. I had to know who was involved. I started with the shared digital life. We had a family Google Drive, something I had set up for ease of planning. It was where we kept insurance papers, mortgage documents, and shared photo albums. I had always been the one to organize it, but Mark had been the one to upload the backups from his work phone. I started digging into the hidden folders. I wasn't looking for photos this time, I was looking for patterns. I filtered the folders by date. Then I overlaid those dates onto my own work calendar for the last 3 years. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Every single business trip I had taken, every conference in Vegas, every meeting in London, every time I had been away to grow our future, had been a calculated window of opportunity for them. There were folders labeled Sarah's apartment, kitten, and beach house. I opened them one by one. I found photos of Mark and Sarah at my mother's summer cottage in the Hamptons. They were there on the 4th of July 2 years ago. I remembered that weekend perfectly. I had stayed home because I had a massive project deadline. I had called my mom crying over the stress of it, and she had told me, "Don't worry, honey, focus on your work. Sarah and Mark are coming up to help me clear out the garage." They weren't clearing the garage. They were spending the weekend in my family's cottage, laughing at my expense while I was eating lukewarm takeout at my desk, thinking I was doing this for us. The more I looked, the more the conspiracy became undeniable. I found a group chat on a platform I rarely used, which was still logged in on the web browser. It was a thread titled The Secret Society. It wasn't just Mark and Sarah. My mother was in the chat. My cousin, who lived a few towns over, was in the chat. They were discussing my schedule. They were mocking my ambition. There were messages from my mother. She's so obsessed with that job, she doesn't even notice what's happening under her own nose. It's almost sad. And Sarah's reply, "She thinks she's winning at life. She has no idea she's the one who's actually losing." I spent hours scrolling. I read about dinners they had together while I was supposedly too tired to come. I read about how they all pooled money to help Sarah get an apartment closer to Mark's office. They were building a life for each other, financed by the stability I was working so hard to provide. They weren't just cheating on me, they were actively laughing at my devotion. I wasn't just the unlucky wife, I was the punchline of a 3-year-long private joke. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Miss you, babe. The hotel is quiet. Wish you were here." I stared at the screen. If I had answered, if I had confronted him, I would have been reacting out of pain. I would have been the hysterical wife, the one who couldn't handle the truth, and they would have found a way to frame me, to make me seem unstable. They were already painting that picture in their group chat. I realized then that if I wanted to burn this down, I couldn't just throw a match. I had to ensure the entire structure collapsed while they were still inside. I turned off my phone, took a deep breath, and started a new spreadsheet. I titled it The Extermination. I began documenting everything: dates, times, locations, and the roles each family member played. I was going to play the grieving, tired wife coming back from a canceled trip in 48 hours. I was going to walk back into that house, hug my husband, kiss my sister, and thank my mother for her support. They thought I was oblivious. They thought I was the fool who worked too hard to notice the world crumbling, but I was going to be the silent architect of their ruin. I didn't want a divorce. I wanted an audit of their souls, and I was going to ensure that when the bill came due, they wouldn't have enough currency left to pay it. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in emotional endurance. I didn't return to the hotel just to hide. I returned to perform. By Friday morning, I had scrubbed my social media, changed my passwords, and prepared a narrative that would make me seem like the exhausted, overworked wife who barely had the energy to keep her eyes open. When I finally walked through the front door of our home on Friday evening, my heart was a cold, hard stone, but my face was a mask of weary happiness. "Elena, you're back early!" Mark was in the kitchen, and for a second, I saw his eyes flicker with something that wasn't joy, it was calculation. He was wondering if I had seen anything. He was wondering if the illusion was still intact. He crossed the room and pulled me into a hug. I inhaled his scent, the same expensive cologne I had bought him for our anniversary, and it made me want to scrub my skin until it bled. "I missed you so much," he whispered against my hair. "I missed you too," I lied, the words tasting like ash. The Chicago trip was a nightmare, delayed flights, endless meetings. I just wanted to be home. "Well, you're home now," he said, stepping back and flashing that dazzling, predatory smile. "Sarah is coming over for dinner. She's been worried about you. She said you haven't been answering your texts quickly." Of course she was coming over. They were probably checking to see if I had found the theater of their affair. I nodded, playing the part. "That's sweet. I really need to see her." The dinner was an agonizing piece of theater. Sarah arrived an hour later, bearing a bottle of wine and a fake sisterly concern that was so transparent, I almost laughed out loud. She sat at the table talking about her day, her voice lilting and sweet, while her hand brushed against marks under the table every time she thought I wasn't looking. I watched them. I watched the micro-expressions, the way he looked at her when he thought I was checking my phone, the way she mirrored his posture. It was an intricate dance of betrayal, and they were performing it right in front of me, convinced that I was too stupid to see the choreography. "You look tired, Elle," Sarah said, leaning in, her eyes wide with feigned empathy. "Is work really that stressful? Maybe you should take a break. You know, Mark and I were just talking about how much you've been pushing yourself." "I think you're right, Sarah," I replied, forcing a soft smile. Maybe I do need a break. Maybe I need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "What bigger picture, babe?" "Just our future," I said, looking him dead in the eye. Thinking about what really matters. Thinking about us. I spent the rest of the evening feeding them the narrative they wanted. I was the stressed-out wife, the one whose mind was elsewhere, the one who was too focused on her career to notice the rot in her own foundation. But the moment they left Mark to finish some work in his study and Sarah to her apartment, I went to work. I waited until I heard the rhythmic breathing that told me Mark had fallen asleep. Then, I didn't go to the study. I went to the one place in the house he thought was off-limits, the floorboards under the walk-in closet. I had noticed 3 months ago that one of the boards in the back corner creaked differently than the others. I had ignored it then, thinking it was just the house settling. Now, I knew better. Using a screwdriver from the garage, I pried up the board. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline so potent it felt like electricity. Underneath, tucked away in a velvet-lined box, wasn't jewelry or cash. It was a digital ledger, a physical encrypted hard drive, and a stack of printed bank statements. I took them to the kitchen, the only room where I could keep the lights low. As I scrolled through the data on the drive, the full scale of the operation became clear. It wasn't just about the affair. Mark was using our shared assets to fund a shell company registered in his mother's name. He was draining our mortgage payments into that account, then moving the money to Sarah's consulting firm. They weren't just betraying me emotionally, they were systematically looting my life to build theirs. He was bankrupting us, betting that I would eventually get tired and quit my job, and when I did, the house would be gone. The savings would be gone, and I would be left with nothing but the debts they had accrued. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the money. It was a folder labeled Exit Strategy. Inside was a draft of a divorce settlement written months ago, detailing how they planned to frame me for financial impropriety so he could walk away with the house, the savings, and, cruelly, the support of my own mother. They had a plan. They had a script. And they were just waiting for the right moment to perform it. I stood in the dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. I had everything. I had the financial proof of their fraud, I had the evidence of their collusion, and I had their roadmap to my destruction. I looked at the kitchen clock. 2 a.m. In 4 hours, the world would wake up, and Mark would come downstairs, expecting coffee and a wife who was still playing her part. I looked at the folder and felt a smile spread across my face, a smile that felt as sharp as a razor. They thought they had written the play. They thought I was the lead actress in a tragedy. But they hadn't realized that while they were busy rehearsing their lines, I had already rewritten the entire third act. I closed the laptop, put the documents back into the box, and slid it back under the floorboard. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, in the dark, planning exactly how I would feed them their own script, one devastating line at a time. Mark thought he was the hunter. He had no idea he was already cornered. The morning after I discovered their exit strategy, the sun rose with an infuriating cheerfulness. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, my movements fluid and calculated. Mark was there, brewing coffee. He turned to me, his eyes bright with that practiced affection that used to make me melt. "Morning, beautiful," he said, moving to kiss my forehead. "Sleep well? You looked so peaceful when I came to bed." "I did," I replied, forcing my voice to remain soft, layered with the exact amount of fatigue he expected. "Just really thinking about the future, Mark. About us. Maybe it's time we really started looking at our long-term goals. I feel like we've been drifting a bit." He paused, the coffee mug hovering in his hand. He didn't know it, but he was holding his own execution order. "We're not drifting, Elena. We're just busy. But you're right. Maybe we should sit down this weekend and look at the finances, get everything aligned." He was taking the bait. He thought I was finally becoming the submissive, financially focused wife he had been trying to mold, the one who would sign over the mortgage without asking questions. I smiled, a small, genuine-looking smile. "I'd love that." Once he left for the office, the mask dropped. I didn't have time for tears or self-pity. I had a war to win. I spent the next 4 hours in the study, which I now treated like a tactical command center, executing the first phase of my plan. I accessed the shell company's portal. It was surprisingly easy. Mark had been so arrogant, so convinced that I was a total tech illiterate, that he hadn't bothered to rotate the administrative keys. I didn't steal the money. That would have alerted him immediately. Instead, I rerouted the funds. I initiated a delayed transaction protocol, moving the bulk of the mortgage payments and the consulting fees into an escrow account I had opened under the name of an entity that looked like a legal tax compliance firm. To Mark, it would look like a banking glitch or a regulatory delay. To me, it was the first brick removed from the wall. Then came the second phase, sowing discord. I called Sarah. "Hey, sis," she answered, her voice dripping with that sickening, sugary faux innocence. "Mark told me you're finally taking some time off. Are you okay? You sounded a bit weird on the phone yesterday." "I'm fine, Sarah. Just overwhelmed," I said, playing the role of the fragile, overwhelmed sister to perfection. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. I was looking through Mark's laptop yesterday just to find some photos, and I saw a weird file titled Exit Strategy. It had your name on it, along with a bunch of financial projections. I didn't open it, of course, because I trust you both. But it seemed really intense. Is Mark planning something big for your firm?" There was a silence on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy I could feel it vibrating through the phone. I knew I had hit a nerve. "Oh, that?" Sarah's voice spiked, losing its sweetness for a split second before she recovered. "That's just a business partnership, Elle. You know how Mark gets? He's always planning these elaborate investment schemes. I told him he should have mentioned it to you, but he said he didn't want to worry you with complicated financial talk. Don't stress about it." "Right. Complicated financial talk?" I echoed, keeping my tone vacuous and agreeable. "I'm just glad I have you too. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll always have us, Elena," she said, and I heard the underlying threat in her voice. "We're a family, right? We look out for each other." "Always," I whispered. After I hung up, I felt a surge of triumph. I had just introduced paranoia into their comfortable little nest. Sarah would confront Mark. She would demand to know why I had seen the file. They would start bickering, start pointing fingers, and start questioning how much I really knew. Their unity was their greatest weapon, and I was going to turn it into their biggest liability. That afternoon, I sent out the invitations for the dinner party I had mentioned in my head. Not just to Mark and Sarah, but to my mother, and crucially, to the firm's chief auditor, a woman named Vanessa who had been a mentor of mine before I left the firm. I framed it as a celebration of our financial successes. I knew the invite would look normal to everyone else, but to Mark, seeing Vanessa's name on the guest list would be the first sign that the walls were starting to close in. I spent the rest of the day finalizing the setup. I moved the digital documents to a secure server, deleted the local traces, and then wiped the tablet clean so they couldn't see what I had accessed. By the time evening arrived, I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their ruin. As I walked through the house, I didn't see the furniture or the decor anymore. I saw a stage, and I had already decided exactly where the trapdoor was going to be placed. Mark was coming home in an hour, and he was going to walk right into a house that looked exactly like the one he had lived in for years, but which had fundamentally transformed into a prison cell. And the best part? He was going to spend every second of the next 24 hours thanking me for the hospitality. The atmosphere at the table was so thick you could have cut it with a steak knife. When Vanessa, the chief auditor from the firm, stepped across our threshold, Mark's face went chalk white for a split second before he managed to pull on his mask of a polite host. It was the first moment I saw pure, raw fear in his eyes. Not fear of a divorce, not fear of a shouting match. This was the fear of a man who suddenly realizes someone has unlocked the door to his vault and is standing there, staring directly at the piles of stolen money. Vanessa was a professional in every sense of the word, dressed in a cold navy blue suit, with a notebook in her hand that felt like a dangerous weapon in this company. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation drifted toward pleasantries, the weather, vacation plans, the company's successes. But beneath the surface of these polite exchanges, a silent war was being waged. "Mark, honey, Vanessa was mentioning over coffee recently that the audits this quarter are exceptionally thorough," I said, sipping wine that tasted like revenge. She was talking about all these cases of embezzlement in the industry. It's so terrifying, isn't it? That people are capable of destroying the life's work of others just to live a moment of luxury. Mark swallowed a bite of meat. his jaw tightening. Well, an auditor's job is thankless, Elena. They're always looking for trouble where everything is perfectly fine. Right, Vanessa? He tossed out, trying to force a laugh. Vanessa didn't return the smile. Her gaze remained cold, almost clinical. We don't usually look for trouble where there isn't any, Mark. We look where the numbers stop adding up. And lately, we've noticed some very interesting anomalies in the capital flow. Of course, it's only a matter of time before we find the source. Sarah, who had been trying to sit quietly all evening, suddenly let out a nervous laugh. Anomalies? Sounds like something out of a crime movie. Maybe we should just focus on the delicious food Elena prepared? It's wonderful, isn't it? It's exquisite, Sarah, I replied, looking her straight in the eyes. But I'm glad Vanessa is here. You know, I've been thinking a lot about investments lately, about how important transparency is. Mark always said that in marriage and in business, we have to be open books to each other. Right, Mark? Mark didn't answer. He stared at his plate as if trying to read a recipe for escape from it. I felt the gaze of my mother on me. She sensed the tension, but was too terrified to ask any questions. That was the most beautiful thing about this game. They were all hostages to my rules. They couldn't leave, they couldn't scream, they couldn't defend themselves because in their minds they were still in my house, in a world where I was the needy, needing support wife. Vanessa, I turned directly to the auditor, ignoring Mark's attempts to change the subject. I heard the firm is introducing new verification procedures for contractors. Is it true that you're now checking all consulting firms you work with, even the smaller ones that your directors work with? Mark flinched. It was a direct hit to his weakest point, Sarah's consulting firm, through which he was laundering the money. Yes, we have expanded the scope of our audit, Vanessa replied, and I heard a note of interest in her voice. We are now checking family and personal connections. It turns out that far too many consulting services are being provided by people who have very close relationships with our employees. It's a phenomenon we will be fighting ruthlessly. I saw the blood drain from Sarah's face. She tried to reach for her wine glass, but her hand was shaking so badly that the wine spilled onto the tablecloth. "Oh, Sarah, be careful!" I exclaimed with feigned concern, grabbing a napkin. "You're so distracted today. Is everything okay? Maybe it's those projects Mark mentioned? About that exit you two are planning?" That was the finishing blow. Mark stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a piercing screech against the floor. "Elena, that's enough. You are not going to drag my professional matters to the dinner table. Apologize to our guests and come with me to the kitchen. Immediately." I stood up slowly, straightening my back. I didn't feel fear. I only felt power. I looked at Vanessa, who was watching us with fascination, then at my terrified mother, and finally at Mark. "Of course, honey," I said, my voice like steel. "Let's go to the kitchen. I have something there that you need to see. Something that isn't a professional matter, but something much more personal." Mark rushed toward the kitchen, furious, fists clenched, convinced that he was about to intimidate me. Sarah tried to follow him, but I grabbed her arm. "You stay here, Sarah. You wanted to be part of this plan. So now be part of the finale. Stay with Vanessa. I'm sure the auditor will have a few questions for you regarding your firm." I left them in the living room, Vanessa, who was already pulling out her phone to make one crucial call to headquarters, and Sarah, who had slipped into a quiet hysteria. I walked into the kitchen, where Mark was waiting for me, ready to attack. I locked the door behind me. This was the moment, the final showdown in our shared home. As I turned to face him, I was holding my phone on which I had turned on the recording. "What are you babbling about?" he screamed, approaching me. "Do you have any idea that you could destroy us both?" "No, Mark," I whispered, looking him straight in the eyes. "It's not me who destroyed us. It's you who destroyed us the day you first lied to me. And now, listen carefully, because this is the last conversation you will ever have with me." I began to list the amounts, the dates, the names of the accounts in Panama, and the invoice numbers I had pulled from his safe. With every word, I saw his confidence melting away. Finally, he sat on the floor, head in his hands, completely broken. But I felt no pity. I felt only one thing. Finally, the time had come to fully show him how terribly he had misjudged the woman he had considered his ideal, clueless wife for 6 years. This was the beginning of the end of his world, and I was ready to watch that world burn. The air in the kitchen felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that makes your teeth ache. Mark, who only minutes ago had been acting like the king of his own meticulously crafted castle, now looked like a plane that had been shot out of the sky, shattered, bewildered, and utterly incapable of controlling the situation. He tried to lunge for my phone, the one on which I was still recording, but I stepped back, leaning against the kitchen island with a level of calm, cold confidence I had never possessed in my life. I knew Vanessa, the auditor, was just outside the door, likely already calling in the authorities. Every sound, every word Mark uttered was currently being etched into the record of his downfall. "Do you think this is a game?" I whispered, watching him clutch his head in his hands, his knuckles turning white. "Mark, you didn't just cheat on me. You betrayed your company. You betrayed every shred of professional ethics you ever claimed to have. And most importantly, you turned my life, our life, into a prop for your dirty little side business. You thought I would be the perpetually blind wife, the one who signs whatever you shove under her nose without a second thought. You were so wrong." At that moment, the door swung open. Vanessa didn't look like a guest anymore. She looked like an executioner. There was no empathy in her eyes, only a clinical, professional detachment. She walked past me, ignoring Mark, who was still huddled near the cabinets, and dropped a thick folder onto the island. It was packed with documents, transfers, offshore account statements from Panama, and the shell company contracts I had helped her locate while Mark was busy trying to salvage his dignity. "Mark," she said, her voice steady and devoid of inflection, "I've already coordinated with the authorities and our firm's legal counsel. Your manipulations with the Panama accounts and the use of shell companies tied to Sarah's consulting firm aren't just internal company disputes anymore. This is grand larceny. This is financial fraud. I've seen the transfers. I've seen the falsified clinical trial reports you signed off on. Your career didn't just end tonight, Mark. Your life as a free man is effectively over." Sarah, who couldn't stand the suspense, pushed into the kitchen, her face a mask of panicked rage. When she heard Vanessa's words, she let out a piercing shriek. It wasn't a cry of sorrow or regret. It was a screech of pure, unadulterated selfishness. "You ruined everything, Elena!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me, tears of fury streaming down her face. "We were building a future. We were trying to make something better than this miserable, boring existence. You were always too obsessed with your career, too buried in your spreadsheets to notice that Mark and I found something real. You forced his hand. You made him look for the warmth and understanding that you were too cold to give him." I started to laugh. It was a bitter, dry sound that seemed to shock even Sarah into silence. "Are you truly delusional, sister?" I stepped toward her, and she instinctively recoiled, her bravado faltering. "Warmth? You called draining our family's savings, mortgaging our home for your consulting business, and plotting my financial ruin warmth? You're not a sister, Sarah. You're a parasite. You've been feeding off my success for years, smiling at me at brunch while you were busy undoing my life behind my back. And you, Mark." I turned my gaze to him, his face now a mask of gray misery. "Did you really believe I would never find out? Did you really think your perfect, naive wife was just a convenient accessory to your perfect life?" Mark finally looked up. His eyes were hollow. It seemed that for the first time in his life, the sheer crushing weight of his catastrophe had actually landed. He hadn't just lost a woman, he had lost his status, his credibility, and the resources that allowed his ego to breathe. He looked like a stranger, small, pathetic, and undeniably guilty. Then, my mother walked into the kitchen. She looked aged, her shoulders hunched as if under an invisible burden. She knew. She had known from the very beginning. She had watched, silent and complicit, believing that it was for the best, because Mark brought money into the family, and Sarah was the favorite daughter. "Mom," I said, my voice finally trembling, not with sadness, but with the terrifying clarity of betrayal. "You knew. You sat at our table, you held my daughter in your arms, and you knew that your son-in-law was sleeping with your own daughter. How could you? How could you look me in the eyes for 3 years and smile while you helped them build this lie?" She bowed her head, unable to meet my gaze. In that silence, I understood the final, most painful piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just a betrayal of a spouse. It was a conspiracy of a bloodline. I had been nothing more than a financial engine for them, a resource to be tapped until they decided it was time to replace me. Outside, the first wail of sirens cut through the suburban night. Police cruisers began to flood the driveway, their blue lights casting long, distorted shadows through the kitchen window. Vanessa nodded at me, the signal that the trap had been fully sprung. Mark, seeing the flashing lights, made a desperate, pathetic attempt to bolt toward the back door, but the officers were already there, waiting. I stood in the center of my kitchen, in the middle of the wreckage of the life I had built for them, and felt an impossible, soaring sense of lightness. The play was over. The actors had been exposed. The audience, those who knew the truth, had witnessed the final act. I didn't care what they would say in their defense. I didn't care about their excuses. I knew one thing. Tomorrow would be the first day of my life, a life where there would be no room for lies, no room for shadows, and absolutely no room for any of them. I had paid them back with the exact currency they had spent on me for years. Cold, hard, inescapable reality. And as the officers led Mark out of the house in handcuffs, his eyes meeting mine one last time, I felt no hatred, only a profound, sweeping gratitude. I was awake, and I was finally, irrevocably free. It's been exactly 1 year since that dinner party, a night that effectively incinerated my past and forged the steel of my present. People often ask me if I regret the way it ended, if I regret destroying my family in such a public, brutal fashion. My answer is always the same. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped propping up a collapsing building. The wreckage was already there. I just turned on the lights so everyone could finally see it. The fallout was swift and absolute. Mark was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The evidence I gathered, the ledger, the shell company documents, the recordings of his own admissions, was so damning that his defense attorney didn't even bother to mount a real case. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal facility. I haven't visited him once. I don't plan to. Every time I think of the money he stole and the lies he breathed into our home, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel a strange, cold indifference. He is simply a mistake I corrected. Sarah's fate was a slow, painful social exile. After the firm's audit exposed her consulting firm as a money laundering front, she didn't just lose her career, she lost her standing in every circle she cared about. She's currently working in a retail job 3 towns over, living in a cramped studio apartment, and from what I hear, she's become a recluse. No one wants to be the friend of the sister who tried to steal her own sibling's life. She reached out once, 6 months ago, with a long handwritten letter full of pathetic justifications and pleas for sisterly forgiveness. I didn't open the envelope. I shredded it, unopened, and threw it in the trash along with every other reminder of the person I used to be. My mother, that was the hardest cut, but also the most necessary. She's still in the family home, but it's a house of silence now. My other relatives, who were quick to judge me for being too harsh, eventually learned the full extent of the conspiracy she helped orchestrate. She's alone. She calls sometimes, leaving voicemails about forgiveness and blood ties, but I've blocked her number. There is no such thing as blood ties that justify betrayal. Trust is a currency, and she spent every cent of hers a long time ago. As for me, I left the city. I packed up everything that didn't remind me of the lie and moved 3 states away. I reclaimed my maiden name. I started a new career. And for the first time in my adult life, I wake up in the morning without the weight of other people's secrets pressing on my chest. I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate your own worth to keep the peace. I don't keep the peace anymore. I keep boundaries. I'm dating again, slowly, and I've developed a 6th sense for deception. The moment someone tries to gaslight me, the moment a story doesn't add up, I'm out. No second chances, no talking it through. I learned the hard way that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time, not after 3 years of building a life with them. People tell me I'm hardened. I prefer to think of it as being refined. I'm not broken. I'm just finished with the illusions. If you're listening to this and you feel that nagging doubt in the back of your mind, that suspicion that your spouse is hiding something, or that your family isn't as supportive as they claim, listen to it. Don't play the part of the fool for 1 second longer than you have to. Your intuition isn't a flaw, it's your survival instinct. Trust it. And if you have to burn your world to the ground to find the truth, do it. Because the view from the ashes is much clearer than the view from a foundation built on lies. I'm done with the revenge. I'm done with the past. I'm finally living my own story. And for the first time, I'm the only one holding the pen. Thanks for listening to my journey. Stick around. There are plenty more stories where this came from. And believe me, we're just getting started.